Welcome to everyone coming in and joining us. You're all piling in here. It's a couple minutes past the hour in whatever time zone you're in. Ruth and Laura, are y'all ready to get started? Wonderful. My name is Amy. Thank you for joining us today for Is There a Fast Track? Exploring the Road to Thriving Mission and Ministry. I am with the Healthier Congregations Task Force right now in Edmonton, Alberta, and I was formerly working with the BCM in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This is week 3 of our virtual Leadership Focus Conference. Over 150 Moravians from at least 65 different churches and agencies have registered. So far, over 365 devices have logged on to 10 live sessions we've already had. And we're especially glad that this year's conference is an interprovincial event. And it's co-hosted by the Moravian Board of Cooperative Ministries and the Healthier Congregations Task Force, as you know. Your friends and colleagues in ministry can still register by visiting moravianbcm.org as the conference runs through March 13th. You're currently all muted, but you'll have an opportunity to share with your voices later. If you've got comments or questions during the presentation, feel free to put them into the chat box, say hey, give us some great feedback. Our presenters today have a lot in common. Both are preachers' kids. They've grown up in the middle of the institutional church, enabling them to clearly recognize both the joys and challenges of faith leadership. Both have attended church-affiliated colleges. Ruth graduated from Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and Laura received her BA and also worked for Salem College in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Both are employed by the church, Ruth since 2012 as the executive director of the Moravian BCM, Southern Province, and Laura as first at Laurel Ridge Camp and Conference Center, then since 2012 as an executive with the Interprovincial Moravian Ministries Foundation in America. And both are lay leaders, not ordained clergy, and they choose to share and adapt their experiences for the public, nonprofit, and private sectors while serving God and the Moravian Church in unique ways. And most importantly, and something that they share with me, we all have very sweet black cats. Ruth and Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all are doing well today. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we appreciate that you have joined us on our little road trip today. We are going to explore together some practical strategies and tools for congregations to use as they prepare the way for the future. Would encourage you to, of course, keep adding your names and where you're from in the chat box, and to use the chat box as well as questions come to mind. We are going to keep an eye on those, and then we'll of course have time for questions and answers at the end of our conversation. But take advantage of that chat and let us know what's on your mind, where you're from. And again, good to be with you as we get ready to discover whether there is a fast track.
Yes, so that's the question, right? Is there a fast track to thriving mission and ministry? And I will be happy to tell you, as you probably already know, that the answer is nope, definitely not. It is really more of what you see here, the unpaved road with some potholes, a destination that can seem somewhat overwhelming. But there is a lot of hope, and we'll talk about that today. So we're going to take a little road trip and explore together. And you will definitely need to strap in for today's journey, because we are going to be flying through some information for you. So I hope you will all find it very useful as we continue. So hang in with us as we move along pretty quickly here.
So, as we get ready to go on our journey today, we thought it would make sense to first ask, where are we now? You all know as you get ready to take a car trip, there's certain things that you do to make sure that your vehicle is ready to go. You check the oil, you look at the tires, make sure they've all got air, make sure the car maybe is clean, room for your luggage, all those kinds of things. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to kind of do a little check of our vehicle before we go, and you'll see a poll popping up. This poll has 4 questions, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to go ahead and respond to each of those questions. If you are having trouble with the poll, let us know in the chat box, please. Folks doing okay being able to work through the poll?
I'm seeing some answers. They're popping up. I'm going to share them when most of us have had a chance to weigh in. All right, well, I'm going to end the polling and share the results so that you can see, and you may have to scroll to see those, but looks like when we think about our faith community's resources, I see a lot of sufficient and some insufficient, right? A little bit of that as well. And of course, a little bit of abundance. Definitely there. So it's okay. Our gauges are looking okay, Laura. So.
Well, given the last year, I am excited to see that we're landing more in the sufficient or above box than we are in the insufficient, although it looks like we've got some folks there too. So great. Thank you all for considering your resources as we check our gauges before we head out on the road together.
Did the box disappear in front of you? Because I don't see the same thing. So is the poll still up or did it go away? It's gone.
I still see it.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. So yeah, the resources are certainly something we've got to consider, right? But that's not all. There've really been a tremendous amount of shifts in the institutional church, certainly in the last year, but even honestly in the decades prior, probably 50, 60 years, we've been seeing a lot changing in the church. And here are a few examples of what we're seeing. Church, particularly the 50s and 60s was really the center of social life. Now it is one of just many choices. Regular worship used to be sort of that weekly worship, right? That was regular attendance. More recently, it's 1 to 2 times a month has really been considered regular attendance. And with COVID and the online options, membership and attendance is even a little more tricky to measure, right? We used to be just throw open the doors and people would just walk in. We really didn't have to do much of anything, frankly. There was this real just sort of mindset of abundance that was there. Now, and it's really been decades, we've seen a slow but steady decline in membership and more of a scarcity mindset. Lots of young families. When Laura and I were growing up in the Moravian Church in Forsyth County, there were lots of young families, right? Lots of kids with young families, and we were some of them. But now we're seeing more aging congregations that bring their own joys and challenges. Plenty of resources now, more like fewer resources. And as we hit the pandemic and all those challenges, we move from what was a synchronous model, Sunday mornings at 11 at the church building, right? A very one time, one place, one date, to very much of an asynchronous model, which is what we're obviously doing now with this conference. People can attend live, but they can also have an opportunity to watch later at their leisure on demand, right? So very different than what we're used to. Also, we've gone very quickly from what we'd say is an analog or sort of non-digital church. You may have heard Ryan in his keynote talk about how just half of churches had a website prior to COVID. So things have changed real quickly from the analog sort of building-based church to something that is much more digital and web-based. So And if you think of those bold ones there at the bottom, I mean, that's just the last year. So all these shifts, we're talking about decades, but these last couple are just in the last year, a tremendous amount of change. And so we do see the light at the end of the tunnel for COVID, which is wonderful. But it's still unclear like where we're going. So when we think about what the post-COVID world looks like, there really are a lot of question marks. The future is uncertain, which certainly can create anxiety and fear for folks.
So what's next? Had a little bit of time to think about resources in your community of faith. You've heard some of those shifts that have taken place, are taking place, that Ruth just mentioned. We're thinking about this trip, and we think we are ready to hit the road. So thinking about those resources that you have, what would you say is most important for your congregation to do next? So it's just one question this time for the poll. Do you need to plan for the future, focus on taking care of each other, focus outward, or focus on developing sufficient resources? And we realize that for some of those, you may think you've got more than one answer that resonates. So which one resonates the most? Does your gut instinct say, yes, this is what we need to focus on most? Anybody having trouble with the poll, just let us know in the chat and we'll see if we can help you fix it. Looks like we've got planning for the future on a lot of folks' minds. Maybe a couple more seconds to answer the poll. I've got almost everybody that's responded.
All right, 100%. So let's look at these results. 60% of you said planning for the future, kind of that what do we need to do next? What's it going to take to gather inclusively? What's it going to take to collaborate and partner in order to get things done more creatively? What are we going to have to let go of? What are we going to try that's new? All that kind of stuff. Taking care of each other, so important right now. Figuring out our focus outward, and developing sufficient resources. So that gives us a little snapshot there. All right. So the poll was really designed to give you an idea of kind of what is your current reality, right? Where are your resources? You've checked your gauges, you determined your route, kind of what your immediate next step looks like. Now it's time to hit the road, at least on our journey today. The rest of the workshop is going to be a road trip to explore some practical strategies that might help you along the way. And we're also going to consider some fundamentals in the role of leadership as you explore what God is calling your faith community to do and be. Remember, you'll hear some repetition. Some will be a little more high level, some will be more practical. There'll be a lot, but know that that for each of you, it may resonate in different ways, right? It's said one way here, and then it's said another way. But we hope that some of the things will resonate with you, and just feel free to take what you want and leave the rest. So let's get going. We talked about some shifts earlier, acknowledging essentially the changing reality of church, which we've known has been happening for quite a while. And forgive me for mixing my metaphors. We're still in the transportation mode, being that it's a bridge, but consider the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras. It was built to be so strong as to withstand hurricanes, which is a concern in Honduras. And Hurricane Mitch came along in 1998. 75 inches of rain dropped there in 4 days, and over 150 bridges were destroyed, but not the Choluteca Bridge. If you'll look at this picture, you'll see there it stands very strongly, but you might notice the storm moved the river. And that is really a lot like the church today. The institutional church is still strong. We've withstood a lot in the centuries that we've been around. We have lasted through many things, but much is changing and will still be changing. The river has moved, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Many of us want to move the river back under the bridge, but it's a lot harder to change the culture than it is to move the bridge or even maybe build another one altogether. So churches were designed and built for a different river, a different culture in some ways. While the temptation is going to be great to try and redirect the massive river back to flow back under the indestructible bridge, let's all go back to normal, right? I think the work set before the church leaders is to build a new bridge. And so I think that's an important paradigm shift to consider as we think about our faith communities.
I'm going to build off of what Ruth just said and bring up another image. It's spring, so hopefully this will resonate with folks, even if you're in areas where it's not quite warm enough for a lot of growth yet. It's important to think about letting go, the power of pruning. If you've ever worked with a plant or a tree or a bush, flower, any type, you probably have experienced this. Watering plants is not enough. Yes, they will grow, they will look pretty, such as the hydrangea there on the left. It has received enough water and it has blooms, and there it is. But then you look at that hydrangea on the right, which someone spent a lot of time pruning, and then this is how it looked the following year. And you notice a lot of differences. When I look at the one on the right, I see those bigger blooms that are really, really colorful. The tree has shape again, whereas in the pre-pruning, it was sort of losing its shape. It was just kind of a blob. Now it looks more tree-like. But really those blooms strike me that they're overall bigger. They seem to maybe be more abundant, but definitely that they're more colorful. We wanted to include this image today because I think it's important to think about our churches and this power of pruning within the church. So what a perfect time right now before things change again. And in many of our minds, that's let's go back to normal, right? What a time to look and say, what do we have that needs pruning? Are there things in our environment that are to the detriment of the health of our church? Are they impacting the health of our church and possibly hurting it, decreasing its life? So just be aware of that as you look at your ministries and kind of are making decisions as you head down the road to spend some time pruning and thinking about maybe what needs to be cut back or removed so that as a whole, you have a healthier and more vibrant church.
I mean, I think a question we often ask ourselves as we work on some of this stuff is, why is this stuff so hard? Why have we been struggling so long to figure out how to fix the church? Why aren't people just rushing back in? What's going on? Why can't we just find the right expert to tell us what to do and do that thing and have it work and everything's better? And part of the answer to that question is that we're trying to solve adaptive challenges with technical solutions. And as you can see with the image here, with an adaptive challenge, there is a lot more that meets the eye, right? Ronald Heifetz, who is a Harvard lecturer, suggests that there are two types of problems that leaders have to address. One is technical and one is adaptive. And technical challenges essentially are those dilemmas that are met with known, tested, and predictable answers. So, they've been encountered before and we know what's required. When your car starts making a funny noise, you take it to a mechanic, right? When you break a tooth, you go to the dentist. An accountant does your taxes, not the lawn guy, right? Churches that go to cool workshops like this one to learn how to grow, because we're going to give you all the answers, right? Those are technical challenges. There's a known problem and there's a clear solution, right? Usually with an expert who can work on it. But with adaptive challenges, those are situations that present new dilemmas. Really, it's territory that has not been traveled before. And the problem sometimes isn't even easily defined, right? So solving it requires new learning, creative ways of thinking, some risk-taking, some experimentation. Adaptive challenges require not the predefined answers of so-called experts, but the hard work of discernment by those that are most affected by the issue. And sometimes bringing all those stakeholders together can be a challenge in and of itself, right? Let me give you an example of a way that we as the church might try to solve an adaptive challenge with a technical solution. So if your church is experiencing a budget crisis, simply stated, that means there's not enough income to cover expense, right? So what do? Most most churches are going to default to a technical solution or a combination of technical solutions. They're going to try to find more money, right? They're going to cut expenses. Maybe they'll even lay off staff. They're going to postpone things like capital expenditures, buying that new organ or the roof, right? They're going to see what kind of endowment interest they might be able to draw on. They might have, down here in the South, we have chicken pie dinners. They might have a few more of those, a few more chicken pie dinners, see what we can raise. Maybe they'll even take out a loan. All of those are technical solutions that may fix the crisis in the short term, but won't solve the underlying problem, which may actually be a very different thing. So more than likely, this crisis is a result of membership decline, right? That may be a manifestation of some of the changing realities of church that we talked about before when we looked at the list of shifts. And that may require us to revisit some fundamental questions about our identity, our purpose, our priorities. A budget issue is rarely a financial issue. It is almost always an issue of identity and mission, as I'm sure Laura would love to talk to you about at some point from her perspective. So it is tricky to manage this shift from from moving into figuring out what the adaptive challenge is and solving it. You as a leader may be ready to go on a really big adaptive, thorny, wicked challenge. But your members on your board leadership may not be there. They may not be ready to do that because an adaptive challenge always requires those involved to learn new ways of thinking and doing. And that means change, right? And change is never easy, especially for the church.
So building off that, Ruth, just speaking about challenges, whether they're technical or adaptive, and then learning and whether your congregation is ready to learn. There is a great resource out there, a book by Tim Shapiro. It's called How Your Congregation Learns. And I discovered it through a program about congregations learning and practicing abundance. So we used it for stewardship purposes, but it's much broader than that. Highly recommend it. And that'll be in the resource list that you get as a participant. But wanted to spend a little bit of time just introducing you to some of those key concepts from Shapiro's book about how your congregation learns. Because one thing Ruth and I know is that when we go in and church says, hey, will you come help us with X or Y? If we don't take time to figure out the culture of the congregation, where they are proficient with learning, if we just launch in and say, here's this great 12-step plan, we're not ultimately going to be successful and nothing's going to change. So that's where this book and some of these ideas can step in. So I'm going to use stewardship examples to illustrate them, but again, they can also apply to things within the life of your ministry that are not related to stewardship. So the first thing that's important to think about from how your congregation learns is, are we educating or are we training? What does that mean? Training is providing information to folks. It more or less leaves you with the same worldview. It hasn't changed the nature of who you are. Whereas education does change the nature of who you are and changes your behavior in the long term. To give you an example, we can train you to create a budget, to try to follow a budget, but it takes education to encourage people to be generous, to help people understand why they should be generous. So it's important to identify practices in the life of your ministry, especially around stewardship. Are you training people, just giving them information and hoping that they'll act a certain way? Or are you educating them so they understand the why and their worldview is impacted as a result? Second point that's important to think about is a behavior that's key for success. So Shapiro in all of his research shares that the one sort of key component there of behavior that's important is the congregation's ability to utilize an outside resource and then pair its own creativity with that for success to take place. So that means being able to take the book that Ruth mentions, or Laura comes in and helps you with stewardship, being able to take us or other outside resources and use them, but also say, this is how it applies for our congregation. So again, back to Ruth's point about how we're not just going to say, here's what you do, follow this plan, because it's going to be different. And it takes your congregation's ability to be creative and make what you're learning from that resource work for you. So that's an important behavior to think about in your congregation. Another key point are the sort of three realms of learning. So he presents the idea that we learn as a congregation either in a religious area, a practical area, or an organizational realm. So I'll tell you exactly what those mean. The religious one's sort of obvious. Those are those matters of faith, how we learn from Scripture, how do we practice prayer, worship enhancement, theology of stewardship, that kind of thing. Those are all learning in the religious realm. And then the practical is how we as congregation help our folks, our congregants, with practical things in their life. So that might be day-to-day activities like managing money or preparing for marriage, rites of passage, those kinds of things that we're all experiencing in our day-to-day living. How do we as churches learn and help folks in that area? And then the third one is the organizational. And I'll go ahead and give a spoiler and say most congregations are really proficient in organizational realm and learning there. And so what happens is they try to use that to make everything an organizational challenge. So that's just your day-to-day management of the church, operating budgets, running meetings, supervising staff, all those kinds of things fall under that organizational realm. So again, it really helps to know which realm your congregation is most comfortable in, most proficient in, because there's that tendency to take areas of learning that are not in that realm and make them in that realm, because we like to function with where we're, again, most comfortable and most familiar. And then the final really important part of how congregations learn is how we look at learning as a journey. And I'm going to use a specific stewardship example to illustrate the steps of this journey. So oftentimes when I sit with folks about financial stewardship, one of the first things they'll say is our young adults aren't giving. They're not making pledges or even any kind of contribution. So that's the challenge that they're trying to overcome, is young people not giving. Well, the first thing that we do if we're going on a learning journey is we reframe that to say, we seek to learn what our young people care about, what our young people are interested in, so that our church is an inclusive space where they feel like they have, where they're heard, where they have a voice, and where they're fed spiritually, emotionally, etc. So you'll notice that we seek to learn had nothing to do with why our young people aren't giving. It had to do with we seek to learn about our young people so that we can make sure our church is a place where they feel at home and where they feel invited and welcomed and part of the family, right? So as we go on a journey to learn about this, we've defined it, and now we're going to do some exploration. So that's just figuring out how we're going to respond to this. I would say it's listening to young adults, surveying, finding out what kind of programs, topics are interesting to them. What things going on in the world are they most impacted by, most concerned about? How can the church be a space where they're finding resources and their needs met in those ways? So that's the exploration time. It's really a time of listening and gathering information. Then the next step oftentimes can be disappointment. And I'll give you a real specific example. There may be a long-standing tradition at your church that is so beloved by so many people. And as you sit and you listen to your young adults about what they care about, you may learn they don't really care about that long-standing beloved thing. And I can give you a real specific example. I worked with a church one time where I met with a lot of the older women from the church, and their longstanding tradition was that they hosted a lunch for the teenagers, and they loved it. And it was so much fun, and they looked forward to it every year. Well, when I sat and listened to the teenagers, one of them was brave enough to say, none of us like that lunch with the old ladies. We just don't enjoy it. And we feel like we don't have good manners, and we have to be formal, and all their reasons why they didn't enjoy it came out. So there was a bit of disappointment on the side of those women who loved that lunch, right? But rather than getting stuck there, they went into the next phase of the journey, which is the discovery sort of aha moment. And they looked at what they were doing and said, how can we meet our young people? Well, lo and behold, these women loved gardening. And the young people wanted to learn how to plant gardens and work in the yard. So the women stopped doing the lunch, and they started saying, let's come to the church on a Saturday, and we're going to plant things together. We're going to teach you about different kinds of plants, how to prune them, how to help them grow well. So instead of staying stuck in the disappointment of what they learned, they were willing to say, what can we discover that we could still do to meet these folks' needs? So that's an important part of the journey is not letting that disappointment about what you find keep you from going forward. So the discovery, again, is that sort of aha moment. We've heard some things maybe that we didn't like, but we see that there's a way for folks to still feel fulfilled and to match up where there's areas of interest and need. And so that leads into the next phase of the journey, which is, again, the sort of letting go, the pruning, the taking on something new. And in this case, it was the new activity with the women who had formerly hosted the lunch with the young people, which led to something that they all really enjoyed together. And they got to know one another while being active in the dirt together, just a very different way to be in relationship, right? So they had to be willing to have a new mindset. Those women, they had to say, we're going to let go of this and have a new mindset to be able to relate to our young people. And then the final major phase of the journey is validation. So that's the time where you say, gosh, this effort was really worthwhile. We took the time to listen and find out and learn, and now we're seeing some fruit. So maybe that's suddenly that there are some financial gifts coming in from the young people. And I'd be willing to bet that that's going to be a result of this journey, because you have taken the time to be in relationship with them. And rather than saying they don't give, you've reframed it to learn about their interests and what's important to them, and to make space for them so they feel included and they see themselves in the ministries of the church, so that they have a voice. So that's that validation time where I think typically behaviors are different as a result of learning and education, and not just being stuck in the old way that was. So then the final phase is the new challenge. There's always a new challenge, and being willing to say, okay, what are some of the other things? Oftentimes we express them as gripes or dreams. How do we reframe them as we seek to learn blank so that blank, and then move forward on the journey to address that challenge?
Thank you, Laura. So we know the river's moved. We know we need to let go. We understand it's complex. We know that there are many ways we can be learning, but how do we proceed? How do we get to that? Okay, what do we do next? And I think it is really helpful for leaders struggling to figure out where to begin to consider a framework like Farming Church. And Farming Church, Cultivating Adaptive Change in Congregations, is the name of a book by Mark Tidsworth, who's a coach and author, a pastor in South Carolina. He runs a company called Pinnacle Leadership that provides consulting services to a variety of church and faith-based groups. And he's been a speaker and trainer for us in the Southern Province in the past. So some of you may know his name, Mark Tidsworth. But Mark maintains that congregations want to adapt to the world in which we find ourselves. We want to be the hands and feet of Jesus, of course. And yet when it comes to actual change, maybe required to do that, the church does not go there very quickly or easily. And as pastors and lay leaders, we often underestimate the work that's required in church systems in order to facilitate change. And so we make the mistake of implementing changes too soon. And the readiness of a church when it comes to change really directly influences the success of that change effort. So the quote you see here says 75% of leading change is about cultivating the growing environment, preparing the congregation for engaging change. So it's that cultivation piece. And Farming Church, there's a book and a process, basically, as well as an assessment. It's basically a roadmap for cultivating the growing environment, which is your congregation. So it includes an assessment, a readiness indicator that you and your board can do together, and the results provide some helpful strategies for cultivating this growing environment. It also does a nice job of explaining adaptive change theory, which I talked about earlier. You know, if your leaders have an understanding just of that paradigm shift from technical to adaptive change, can be really helpful. And his book does a nice job of breaking that down. Obviously, we're into another metaphor here, right? The farming metaphor. You know, we think about Jesus in the Gospels uses the farming metaphor a lot. And so, you know, we can see where cultivation might take place. He describes 7 key cultivations, and you see them here. Cultivating faith, trust, super important, vision, leadership, urgency, discovery, alignment. I'm not going to go into each one of those now, but know that the readiness indicator, which you can do with your board as individuals, you could do it with the whole congregation, actually provides you with sort of a result for each of those types of cultivations. So, you may score really high in vision and really low in trust. And then it'll give you some direction as to things you might want to work on to prepare the ground and cultivate things, as it were, prior to moving into some major change, right? I will say that BCM, my agency, which is a Southern Province agency that supports the mission and ministry of our 60-ish congregations, we can facilitate the administration of such a process, or we can get you in touch with Mark himself, who's always happy to do work with folks as well. So I just want you to be aware that there are tools out there to help you prepare for leading folks through change.
So you may be saying to yourself, wow, this car's flying. They said there wasn't a fast track, but we are on the fast track. We are not in a space right now to be thinking about a deep dive about how our congregation learns or farming church. Now may not be the right time. Many of you said that your top priority is planning for the future. So given that, here are some key questions to have conversations with folks in your church about, with your board, if you're a pastor, with your pastor and board, if you're lay leader. These are questions that we think will be beneficial no matter what and worth the time to think about. And they are not hard to think about. The first one, what changed in 2020? I always approach this, especially with a financial stewardship hat on. How did money come in? How did money go out? Did we reallot how we were spending money? Previously, were we pouring a lot of money into our Sunday school program and that changed and we put that money towards technology for the building, that kind of thing. So just looking at what changed broadly as well as specifically in the area of stewardship. What are our focuses for 2021? Maybe you really are still focusing on caring for one another, stewarding relationships with the people within your congregation. Does your congregation know that? How are priorities different? If supporting your local food pantry was an important priority in the past and you've decided we want to do even more support this year, it's making sure the congregation is aware of that as a focus for 2021 and looking at how your budget supports that. Who do we want to reach now? This time is sort of blown and open in terms of our ability to worship online. You may be seeing folks that are joining you every Sunday who are not people that you are familiar with. You may have identified an audience in your neighborhood that's in special need of your community of faith's focus. So who are you trying to reach now? What are your current strengths? Maybe they're different now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago. How are you aware of all the different assets that you have now? As well as, are you aware of the church's current needs and the community's current needs? Again, our church was spending a lot of time going to a local elementary school, providing tutoring. That changed. Now we're reallocating that time and that treasure to something different, and we're making sure the congregation is aware of it. So again, it's just being in tune with what's changed, what's the same, and how does the church know that? Also, how is God calling us now? How is God equipping us for God's work now in new and different ways? And that leads into the next question, which is, what is the equipment that we have? What are we putting to use and what's gathering dust? Maybe your church bus, if you are so lucky to have one, has not been used much because you're not bringing people to worship from your local retirement area. So maybe it's gathering dust. Is there a different way you can use it until you're resuming in-person worship? That kind of thing. Mainly, you just don't want to keep hoping that you can keep trying to do things the same way while the rest of the world is rapidly changing around you. So it's just being aware of both internally what's changing in your congregation as well as externally in your neighborhood, your community, and being able to respond to that. Because I know from hearing from folks in churches, their passions about helping feed people, helping make sure people have a home, have only increased during this time. A lot of us have had our eyes open to the needs, and we want our churches to be able to step up and do more to meet those needs. So just knowing that, being in communication with folks and being willing again to say we may need to prune something as we identify some things that have changed so that we can move forward in a healthy and vibrant way.
Thanks, Laura. And a lot of these questions, are really important to look at, but COVID-19 is kind of the big elephant in the room in terms of where we are right now. And so a lot of us say, I can't even begin to think about like what we're hoping for in the future, when I'm not sure what the future will hold, and I'm not sure what we even need to do right now, what we need to do next. A lot of these questions are addressed in a free tool that I highly recommend to you called What Now? And you can find it on the rootedgood.org website. They're an ecumenical, I call them a brain trust. They do a lot of really cool sort of design thinking kind of stuff. They're and What Now is essentially it's an interactive PDF document that kind of walks you through, in some ways, very similar questions to the ones that Laura just mentioned. But it gives you an opportunity to look at sort of what have we had to get rid of during COVID? What do we know we want to bring back? What do we want to think about letting go of? What are our strengths? What are our ministries? And it just gives you a way to totally examine it and make some really good decisions in the age of COVID-19. It includes some Google Docs and surveys. It can be done in person. It can be done online. You can print it, mail it, share it online. I mean, it's a very flexible tool. It's one that, like I said, you can download from the Rooted Good website yourself, or I'm also happy to serve as an outside facilitator to help with the process with your congregation. If you feel like you would benefit from having somebody who's not you or your preacher or whoever doing the facilitation. There is also another tool on their website called How Will We Gather that just really deals with the question of how your congregation might meet together for worship when it's safe to do so. And it walks you through a process. And I think, especially when you're dealing with conversations that have the potential for conflict, for conflicting priorities, and very strong feelings, having a process you can agree on, that you can go through together, can really provide a framework that is useful and can get you to where you need to be with a minimum amount of discord, right? So I would also recommend to you on our website, moravianbcm.org, there are some resources on regathering, including something that I wrote called A Plan for Regathering, and it's a guide for church boards to walk through as they think about what they might want to do as they regather in person. So I just commend those to you, and Laura's going to talk a little more about stewardship.
Yeah, so another tool that's available for you if you want to take a bit of a dive into your stewardship ministry, the Moravian Ministries Foundation has a stewardship health assessment that we would work with you on. And when we look at stewardship ministries, what does that mean? We're looking at 4 different areas of the life of your congregation. And I should back up and say, we all know stewardship is part of everything we do all the time, whether it's in church or out of church. But oftentimes in our churches, we may have gotten to a point where we think people will react badly to the word stewardship. So we stop using it. But meanwhile, we're still making gifts of time, talent, treasure. We're still going out and feeding people and ministering to one another and singing and all the different ways we make gifts of what God has entrusted to us. That's stewardship. So it's part of everything, whether you're naming it or not. If you walk away today having heard only one thing that I say, it's that you need to start naming it and celebrating it, because it's a beautiful thing that God lets us be God's stewards. So what do we do when we offer up this tool of an assessment? We look at 4 areas. We look at how your congregation, your community of faith understands the theology of stewardship. Do they understand that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it? How is that message being presented and embraced and celebrated? We also look at the mission and vision of the church. Do folks have a sense we're all on this boat together and this is where we're heading? This is what we're trying to do together. What does our collective stewardship accomplish? So we have spent some time there. This doesn't mean we're going to say to you, you need to spend months and months coming up with a new mission statement or a new vision statement necessarily. You may be a church that's done that and then that's set on a shelf and nothing's happened with it. But what's important is to look at how you're helping people understand that their gifts, again, whether that's time, talent, treasure, testimony, are connected to helping the church accomplish something together. So that's that mission and vision piece. Third area that we look at is leadership. If you have somebody in your church who's really passionate about stewardship and they want to come up with this great plan and they want to do all these things, but your board members or your pastor is not embracing it, is not aware of it, not on board with it, chances are the success is going to be limited. And that for sure is something the foundation has seen in the 20 years that we've been offering stewardship services, is if there's not buy-in from your leaders and your pastor, you're only able to go so far with your stewardship conversations. and education. So we spend some time focusing on leadership and their role and how they feel, gauging how they feel about stewardship. And then the final piece of the assessment looks at whether stewardship is a year-round part of the conversation of your church. Again, we know it's all we do with all we have, but oftentimes in churches, I'll step in and they say, well, Laura, we only talk about stewardship in the fall when we want people to make a pledge for the next year. So we may start there and say, let's do some work there. So we evaluate what that looks like. And I want to give you, on the next slide, you're going to see a snapshot of what the assessment looks like. So you go through and you give yourself a numeric, on a numeric scale, a rating, you add it all up, and then you're able to quickly see, gosh, our strength is in the theology of stewardship. We're really good at preaching about it, educating people on it, spending time in the Bible and stewardship, but we don't do so well with involving our leadership or even doing theology of stewardship activities year round. So you're easily able to say, hey, we've got strengths here, we have areas of opportunity here, and it helps us together focus on where to begin. Because it's overwhelming if you look at all four pieces and think, oh my gosh, we have to focus on all four of these at once. So we use this tool to help you see where you're proficient and where you want to improve, as well as to see what resonates with people. If you've got a board that gets really excited about theology of stewardship, wants to craft a belief statement so that everybody in the church is able to say, this is what we believe about stewardship here, then that's important to take those energies and spend time there rather than trying to force folks into a year-round planning process if you're not ready for it. The foundation leads this. This is not something that you're able to get off of our website because we think it's important for you to have a human being that helps you with this and that we work in relationship and walk with you as you use this tool. But it'd be something I'd be happy to talk to you about, and it's free of charge. So there's no reason for you not to take advantage of it.
You know, and speaking of agency programs, right? BCM has spent a lot of time over the last few years working on a discipleship framework called Living the Essentials. Our last two synods in both the Northern and Southern Province had a resolution on the essentials, because we've often said, okay, we love our little statement, but what the heck are the essentials, right? So in a nutshell, our framework that we use is based on how our rich history informs us as we work on our own future. The ancient unity really worked from a framework of God creates, redeems, and blesses us, and we respond in faith, love, and hope. And then the renewed church under Zinzendorf focused on spiritual growth, that really intimate relationship with Christ, and living it out in community, and then taking it to the world through mission, right? So the Essentials Roadmap is essentially a process that we work through. It's customizable for each congregation, where we basically offer some strengths-based action planning, and with more of an outward focus, I would say, but it's a combination of tools that can be helpful to churches. And it includes essentially some work on perhaps small group and spiritual development or spiritual growth. It includes working on community pieces. How are we taking care of each other, congregational care, and who are our neighbors, and how might we be called to care for them as well? What does that look like? And in order to look at our neighborhood, we have to look at our gifts and discover what our own gifts are. What can we as a church do? I met with a church once who was convinced that they wanted to tutor kids after school. Yet they were in a neighborhood that was surrounded by three really large churches, a couple of which looked like had their own schools. So, it was a matter of saying, okay, let's examine what you're really good at and where the gaps are, and see if we can't figure out where's the best place for you to use your gifts, instead of trying to recreate the wheel when you may not have to do that. But it explores questions like, what are we willing to do to bring life God's calling in our church, and what are we willing to let go of? We use a tool called Mission Insight, which some of you are probably familiar with. It's a demographic, geographical program that can provide a really nice snapshot of your neighborhood, not just from a demographic standpoint, but from a psychographic standpoint. It's really based in part on the Experian marketing database, so it gives you a lot of lifestyle information. It's very helpful. I'm the administrator for Mission Insight in the Southern Province. Ben Ingebretson, who's going to be speaking to us on Saturday, is the administrator for Mission Insight in the Northern Province. And the provinces partner together to get a subscription to Mission Insight. And I highly recommend that you reach out to those of, to us, because we can prepare reports, we can bring them to you, we can get you credentials if you've got the savvy to get into the program. It is quite robust. But you can examine your neighborhood that way. And it's a great way to do that now while we can't literally get out and knock on doors. But we can still examine who our neighbors are, figure out what our strengths are, and then take some action and do some holy experimenting. So just know that BCM is happy, and I'm happy to, even with the Northern Province, I'm happy to work with you guys on helping you design a process that would work for you to kind of walk through the essentials roadmap for your church.
One final tool that we wanted to share with you, and this is another stewardship tool that the foundation has available, is a template that we use to help churches with year-round planning. It can be overwhelming to think about trying to come up with that on your own. So we have a spreadsheet that we use that helps churches identify all of the activities, all the ministries, all the things you do. You're able to say, gosh, these are the ones that bring us a lot of joy. These are the ones that people really embrace. Maybe these are the ones that only 2 people embrace at this point. So it's a good way to look at your ministries holistically and then start to identify the logical ways they fit into stewardship. And what I mean by that is there's times of year where they're happening, there's resources that you need for them, that kind of thing. And it helps you start to bring forward, okay, these are the people giving time for this. These are people giving talent for this, and being able to make that more direct connection between everything your church is doing and the fact that it's stewardship. And that's really, really important. And I see a lot of some of the comments that are coming up in chat related to stewardship. So I'm going to try to speak to those with this final stewardship slide that's coming up, and then we can get more into them in the Q&A that's just around the corner. But the last thing that I wanted to leave you with thinking about related to stewardship and the word steward, it's both a noun and a verb, right? We are stewards and we steward things that are entrusted to us. As biblical stewards, we understand that to mean what we do with all God has entrusted to us. When I think of the fact that God loves me so much, that God lets me be responsible for resources, for things that are God's, that brings me a lot of joy. It's also a responsibility. It's a privilege. Those are some things that sometimes I think, because we are so afraid of, or we've experienced the fact that people don't respond to that word steward the way we like, as we step away from using that word, sometimes we miss out on the joy of being God's stewards, because we've gotten stuck. And unfortunately, people think of it as only meaning money, or the church wants something from me. I saw that a comment somebody made. I understand that as a steward, that means God wants something for me, which is a beautiful reframing of what being a steward is, or what stewardship is. Not that I think it's just what my church wants from me, but it's what God wants for me. So there's a lot of work. If you've got people, I like to use the image of a sponge, and you've placed your sponge all over and it's soaked up meaning about the word steward, and some of that water may be some kind of bad, dirty, ugly water over the years for whatever reason. We work hard to help people squeeze the water out and soak up new meaning. Again, the joy, the privilege, the responsibility of being a steward. It's who we are. As followers of Christ, we don't get to walk away from it and say, no, I'm not going to opt into that. We know that's who God created us to be generous, just as God is generous to us. So the foundation spends a lot of time on that individual level, helping people understand that identity as a steward, because we think if you do work there, then it oftentimes translates into people being more generous, whether it's to the church, to God's work through the church, or in other areas of their life. So we've spent really the last year doing a lot of pivoting around how can we help churches better educate people, form, nurture stewards at an individual level, and then also be aware of it at a congregational level, what it means in terms of looking at resources and having enough, the abundance, right? Versus the scarcity, which some of you may be experiencing based on your poll responses about resources. So again, steward, noun and a verb. But if people don't really understand, or if they've had a bad experience with stewardship, that noun, that identity piece may need some work. Before you get to a place where you feel like they have a good holistic understanding of it and are being generous and faithful as stewards.
Thanks, Laura. We're really glad that you decided to join us today on this little road trip. And we hope that you've discovered some practical strategies and tools for your congregation as you prepare the way into the future. And we're going to end with yet another metaphor. Thanks for keeping up with me. I really do appreciate that. In his book, Think Again, which is by Adam Grant, he introduces to his readers a group of firefighters who tragically lose their lives while fighting wildfires. You know, you've probably occasionally heard the stories of the smoke jumpers who will, you know, land in the middle of the fire, and then when the winds suddenly change direction, and it blows the fires towards those who are originally like chasing the fire, right, pursuing the fire and trying to put it out. What they discovered when this happens is that they generally made one tragic mistake that led to their loss of life. They ran, but they were also continuing to carry the tools that they had always used to fight fires, including things like chainsaws and backpacks full of other gear. The investigators had believed that if they could have run 15 to 20% faster if they had just dropped those tools and backpacks. You know, I mean, Grant breaks down the decision making that went into the not dropping their tools. He suggests that they were running on autopilot because as they were running from the fire, they weren't even aware that they were still carrying these tools, right? We can only imagine how difficult it would be in this circumstances to be able to think logically and drop the tools that normally save our lives, right? I mean, but there were some who did drop their tools and it did save their lives. And even for those folks, though, as they debriefed it, it was a really difficult decision for them to lay down the tools that they had been previously, up until that very moment, been using to save their life in such a situation. So, you know, I mean, how do you lay down the tools that previously were saving your life, and then succeed at what you have to do? I mean, so Grant says, when he wraps up this story, he says, if you're a firefighter, dropping your tools doesn't just require you to unlearn habits and disregard instincts. Discarding equipment means admitting failure and rethinking part of your identity. You have to rethink your purpose in life at that very moment. Now, certainly, the work of the church is not as hazardous as firefighting, but there really are some learnings here, I think, for us. You know, it would probably be helpful to us to say, you know, what are the tools that we really need to do ministry in this time and place? And hopefully you have a couple ideas here. What are the practices that help introduce others to the love of Jesus Christ? And then conversely, what are the practices that we're still engaging in that maybe are not as productive as they could be anymore? And what do we need to focus on, and what do we need to let go of and remove from our toolkit so that we can survive and thrive? So those are just some nuggets. Hopefully some have resonated with you. And we've shared with you a bunch of tools that we are kind of challenging the church to use to figure out, you know, which ones we want to use and which ones we want to let go of as we get on that road to thriving ministry and mission. So we're done talking. Laura, you may want to mention some of these resources.
You know, there's a couple on here that we use today. Just for you all to know that the Moravian Ministries Foundation, our stewardship services, there's a tongue twister, free of charge. So please take advantage of us as a resource. We would love to partner with you and take a look at things and see how we could work to grow and nurture stewards in your congregation. So look forward to hearing from you, and you can visit our website, and there's all kinds of resources there as well that you can see for stewardship too, to kind of check out some of what we've got there. But I'd be happy to talk to you and email with you and Zoom with you and start a journey together.
Any questions that you guys have? I'm going to stop sharing now.
Megan, I see your comment about stewardship. Thank you for that. I'll make one more point, and then I promise I won't keep going on about this. One of the ways we framed stewardship in the last year, as we've invited congregations again to be thinking about how they're forming individuals who are stewards, and trying to remove that whole stewardship's just about the church wanting something from me, my money, right? We've framed it in terms of stewardship. Our identity as stewards is 4 different areas. We're caring for ourselves. We are blessed children children of God. God wants us to steward our health, our own bodies. How do we care for ourselves? We are caring for other people. So we're stewarding relationships. That's a key part of it that oftentimes we don't focus on in our churches in a direct way. But that's important. We are caring for our stuff. You guys know the Bible has a lot to say about money and how we care for stuff and whether that becomes an obstacle in our relationship with God. So we focus on how we care for stuff and then how we care for creation. Environmental stewardship is important as well. So when we think of stewardship at the foundation, we think of a sort of a 4-part harmony, being aware of caring for self, caring for others, caring for stuff, and then caring for this place where we are blessed to live that God has entrusted to us. So those may be some ways to start to frame conversations about stewardship that might not feel quite so corporate or even one-sided in one direction that if you're worried that people won't be open to listening based on their response to those words.
Question. This is great information. My question is, how many churches have availed themselves of this kind of introspective learning and action? And I mean, if you had to assess your last 5 years, Laura, of what you've been able to accomplish with MMFA, I think it's great, and well, I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Carol. I will answer that question in a direct way, but also let you know how we offer our stewardship services has changed in the last 3 years, really. What has resonated, I think, most with churches that I've been able to work with is a more long-term relationship where I have conducted some small group conversations. You could call them focus groups, for lack of better words, to facilitate some of that introspective work. I also think it's important to do that at a board level, again, because if clergy and board members aren't on board with the process, it only goes so far. But for years, the foundation, our main goal was to work with you on a creative financial stewardship campaign, which I think was very successful. But what we saw from that was sometimes behavior would go right back to what it was the next year or the next year. So we shifted a few years ago to say, okay, that works and that's helpful, but what can we do to really change? Again, to get to that adaptive level of changing behavior, educating people so that there's more long-term impact. Also, because we know in our churches, you may have heard this, we used to have a pastor who was really great at stewardship, but that pastor left, and now we haven't had a stewardship committee since he or she left. And I will quickly say that's on you all. The pastor's only here for a period of time. So that's that culture piece of, if we haven't really worked to form stewards who have a good holistic understanding of it, then that it's going to ebb and flow depending on leadership. So that has resonated with churches as well. In terms of people who are willing to sit for an intentional period of time, and we like to meet with folks at least 8 times, I would say that, especially right now, that's not something that folks have been doing. But the churches that have been able to do with that, I think, have seen some fruit from it. What's discouraging, Carol, I'll be candid with you, is sometimes leadership changes or the personalities change, and then sometimes the enthusiasm for it can wane a little bit too, and depending on what's going on in the world around it too. So does the process go the way I want it to go all the time? No, but our churches are all different, so we have to be able to accommodate that too. Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I will just say from, BCM does we partner with MMFA in terms of, because oftentimes the conversations we're having overlap, right, in terms of congregational development pieces. And BCM has done sort of a combination of leadership development, sort of one-on-one or small group leadership development, and then congregational development. And, probably in the last 5 years, I've worked with 15 to 20 different churches on any kind of a part of the Essentials Roadmap process, which I mentioned. And with each church, we designed it differently. The challenges we run into are typically is getting it accomplished. They might be able to take the day or two to work together to think about their strengths. And actually, that's usually a pretty energizing experience. Where we run into issues is then when we want to make the thing happen that we want to do, often we're not willing to let go of some things that maybe aren't working anymore, but we're really attached to, our attachments, in order to embrace this new thing that maybe is the obvious next step for us based on our gifts, but we're not ready to let go of some of the other things. And like Laura said, I think too, the personalities in the room, the leadership. So we kind of try to come at it from various ways, and education, like we're doing with Leadership Focus, I mean, is another way. When more people understand some of the paradigm shifts that are happening and some of the different ways to consider what we're facing, to me, that always helps. Just a little.
And I'm going to really quickly speak to Ian. I made a comment in the chat. I'm so glad you did, Ian, because it brought up something. He makes a point about our relationship to money being pretty important. Can we live on less to be able to give more? That's the goal, right? The Ministries Foundation is partnering with 2 different faith-based financial management programs. We're offering those at a greatly reduced cost, whether you want us to lead it in your congregation, you want to lead it, or you want to be a part of a mixed congregational group. Chris is leading a program right now. But one of those is very values-based in terms of what are our values and how do those line up with how we spend our money. And we've pulled some of that conversation and that material to use in our work, and it's been really fruitful. I like to say to churches, if you sit with me and say, we're a mission church, but then I look at your budget and all your money is going to keeping up your building, unless you're using that building all the time for mission, there may be a disconnect between your values and what you want to be about and how you're spending your money. So it is important to be thinking about our relationship with money, because it's messy, it's emotional, it changes on any given day. And as churches, if we're not inviting people to think about that and maybe to learn about it, to grow in it, then we're missing out on an opportunity, again, to form and nurture faithful and generous stewards. So Ian, thanks for bringing up that point. That's really important.
We're so appreciative of you joining us today. Thanks for spending an hour or so with us. And you'll notice in the chat that you've got my email, Laura's email, our websites. Feel free, if you've got questions afterward, to shoot us an email. We're happy to engage. And we will, as I said, Leadership Focus, the conference materials we hope to have up for paid registrants next week, so that you can watch this recording to your heart's content. And we'll include some of the resources, and including a bibliography as well, with some of the books that we've been using in some of our programming too, that might be interesting for you all if you're readers, if you want to do more of a deep dive. So, but I think we're done. And Amy, thank you for being our hostess with the mostest today. We appreciate it very much.
I do my best, and thank you so much, Ruth and Laura. You gave us a lot of great things to think about. I only wish I'd brought some really good road trip snacks to this session. I want to remind everyone before we head out that there are more workshops in Leadership Focus coming up tomorrow to Thursday, March 11th. We've got A Way Forward Together and The Road to Racial Justice. And then Saturday, March 13th, we've got the closing series with Ben Ingbertson. If you signed up for these, you'll get a reminder email from Zoom. And if you want to attend and still haven't signed up, please email bcm@mcsp.org. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.